Welcome back. We are continuing to talk about the need to protect state sovereignty, to rein in the federal government, and to call for reforms. And I'm very grateful that this topic is getting national attention because of Governor DeSantis' leadership. But this is actually an issue that many of us have been calling for years, particularly none other than my good friend Mark Meckler, who is the founder of the Convention of States Project. You can find that at conventionofstates.com. And Mark joins me now. So Mark, you were listening to Governor DeSantis' press secretary in the last segment, and the question that I had for him that I would love for you to respond to is why a separate new petition instead of Governor DeSantis helping advance the petition that has been the Convention of States Project that was already passed in Florida back actually 10 years ago. It was passed April 21st of 2014 that already addresses a lot of these very important reforms.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jenna. I don't know. I don't think we got really an adequate answer to that. I'm a little bit confused. To be fair, Governor DeSantis has long been a supporter of the Convention of States Project. Florida was actually the second state to pass our resolution. Our resolution contains the vast majority of the things he says he's looking for: term limits, balanced budget amendment, and things like that. We also have a broader application that says that we're going to limit the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, meaning we can get rid of things like the Department of Education or the Department of Energy, Health and Human Services, things that we believe are a gross overreach of the federal government. And we know that Ron DeSantis is a true federalist and believes in those things. So I'm a little bit confused by kind of what they're doing right now. They say that they're passing, he wants to pass a BBA. We have a balanced budget amendment portion of our application, only it's broader, and it does things like limits the federal government's ability to impose unfunded mandates, which I think is imperative. It allows us to impose tax caps and spending caps, which a pure BBA doesn't. He talked about term limits. I agree with him. Everybody in America wants term limits. Unfortunately, the term limits application now running in the Florida legislature only allows them to limit the terms of Congress, which empowers the deep state. Something you're very aware of, the power and the evil nature of today's deep state. It allows us to limit the terms of bureaucrats and staffers, and the term limits amendment they're now proposing doesn't do that. So I remain confused as to why confuse the issue, why water it down, and why do things that are less powerful than what they've already done.
And I think that's a great question, and one that I hope the governor's office will follow up on. And you mentioned, Mark Meckler, that the petition for the Convention of States Project that's now been passed in 19 states. And again, you can go to conventionofstates.com. You can look at that map to see where the application has passed, that resolution has passed, where there's active legislation this year. And then in North Carolina, it's passed in one chamber, obviously needs the next one. But in terms of what this petition can do that has already passed in Florida to get rid of the deep state bureaucracy, I want to expand on that a little bit, because that is one of the things that especially Trump supporters and I think conservatives overall over the last 10 years or so, especially in the last few years as well, have seen how much the swamp has just gotten wider and deeper. And one of the biggest things that they have said, that exit polls have shown for why voters want to give Donald Trump another chance, is because they want him to drain the swamp. And the executive office of the president can do some, but this petition that COS is proposing would really expand the ability of to actually accomplish that. And so expand on that a little bit more of what that proposal contains and why that is so critical to actually draining the swamp.
Yeah, so the third part of our application says that in the convention, it can be discussed limiting the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. This goes straight to the heart of the deep state. And while Donald Trump went after the deep state, and I have no doubt if he's elected, he'll do it again, and I appreciate that, almost everything that a president can do individually as the executive can be reversed in the next administration if it's a Democrat, liberal, progressive administration. We've seen that right now with Joe Biden, all the things he's done. I mean, look at what happened at the border. Joe Biden used his pen and opened the border immediately, got rid of the Remain in Mexico policy. We are actually for example, able to give the states concurrent jurisdiction over the federal borders. In other words, to say that states have absolutely the power to enforce border laws and immigration laws. That argument is taking place now in the courts. We can end that argument forever and give states like Texas the ability to enforce the borders. We can do away with particular agencies, specifically, in my opinion, things like the EPA and the Department of Energy, the Department of Health and Human Services, maybe even Homeland Security at this point. We need to do away and remove those authorities from the federal government. We can do those things specifically. And then I would say these crossover, we need term limits on the bureaucrats themselves. The term limits being proposed in the Florida legislature right now, term limits Congress. I understand that sentiment. It's a good sentiment. But the problem is if you limit the terms of state or federal legislators, terms of members of the House of Representatives and members of the Senate, and you don't do the same for staffers and bureaucrats, you make the staffers and bureaucrats much more powerful. And unfortunately, the term limits amendment being proposed right now by the state of Florida and being supported by the governor would do just that. It would empower bureaucrats and staffers.
And this is why it's so important to know what the legislation actually contains, and for listeners to understand why the Article 5 Convention of States has been previously endorsed by Governor DeSantis. I think he's still supportive of that. Why I've long endorsed this. A lot of our fellow constitutional law experts like Mark Levin, Michael Ferris, and others have supported for a long time the Convention of States project. And one of the things that that I know is controversial broadly that I would love you to respond to, Mark Meckler, is that a lot of people try to avoid kind of saying Convention of States because people confuse this term with constitutional convention. And there is this fear that I think is improperly placed just because of the misunderstanding of the term, that this could be a runaway convention. And if we call the delegates together from the states at a convention, then they could do something like repeal the First and Second Amendment, or, some of these things, and basically, reopen the entire scope of the U.S. Constitution for discussion.
Yeah, and there's a couple of ways to slice that. I'll do it quickly, legally first. I'm a lawyer, you're a lawyer, so we know about this kind of stuff. We talk about this kind of stuff. Constitutional convention is what's called plenipotentiary. It means all-powerful. They can do anything they want. This is not that. This is an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments. It has to operate under the United States Constitution as it exists today. It's limited by whatever the states say they want to talk about. When you hear conservatives, and sometimes we do, talk about the idea of a runaway convention, they are espousing the ideas of the radical left in America. That idea was really first proposed by Chief Justice Warren Burger, the Chief Justice that gave us Roe versus Wade. Unfortunately, it was listened to by Phyllis Schlafly, one of the great women in American history, who had become friends with Warren Burger, and she spread that around. This idea of a runaway convention is something that's espoused by literally George Soros and all of his organizations, Common Cause, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, La Raza, MoveOn.org. All these organizations, including Planned Parenthood, talk about the idea of a runaway convention. So when you hear people on the right saying that, they're actually using language created by the left to keep people on the right from looking at this idea and using this Article 5 that's in the Constitution and designed to preserve our constitutional form of government.
And this is so important, Mark Meckler, to understand, as you just described, the difference between having all power to change the Constitution versus power under or provided by and derived from the constitutional language itself. And that's why this type of proposal is under Article 5. This is the exact same as a parallel example of what Governor Abbott is doing right now, of saying, well, the Supreme Court got it wrong. Their power is under the U.S. Constitution, where my power to protect the state from invasion is literally given by the Constitution. And so a court cannot override that particular text. This is why it's so important for all citizens, not just lawyers, not just people who go and argue in court or in policy, to understand the text of the Constitution and what it actually says. And I don't believe that there is any way that we get to some of these proposals for amendments unless we do it through the states and their authority under Article 5, because Congress is the only other way that we can propose amendments to the Constitution. The federal government is never going to restrain itself. This is why the founders specifically gave states that power, like they ensured and protected state sovereignty.
Yeah, and this is really important. The states themselves limit the scope of the convention by passing applications that are limited to whatever they say. In our case, talking about term limits for federal officials, so that's the Congress itself, but also staffers and bureaucrats and the judiciary. By the way, we could also pass an amendment limiting the Supreme Court to 9. I know a lot of people are concerned about that. It also allows for a balanced budget, but more broadly allows for tax caps, spending caps, anything that would fiscally restrain the federal government, and then finally anything that would limit the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. And all the states, 19 so far that have passed this, 15 to go, are using the same language so that the convention is limited to that. And I'll give you a specific example. You mentioned the Second Amendment. That's an important one to my family. My son's a Marine. My mom was law enforcement. We like our guns. We like the Second Amendment. And people say we're going to lose it. Well, right now you have 27 states with constitutional carry, meaning no permit required, 24 states where you can carry your handgun into a state legislature, 14 states where you can actually carry a loaded long gun like your AR into the legislature and watch the proceedings there. So you have all these states that are very strongly pro-Second Amendment. The idea that you could get 38 states or three-quarters of states to ratify an amendment doing away with the Second Amendment is ridiculous, and yet I hear opponents say that all the time.
Yeah, the math just isn't there. And really, a lot of things in politics comes down to math, just like the Electoral College delegate counts, things like primaries, and also things like getting amendments passed or even legislation passed. It comes down to math. And so the math, you're right, Mark Meckler, just isn't there. But the math on the other side for actually calling for the convention and the delegates from the states to get together to propose amendments that then would go to three-fourths of the states. Three-fourths of the states would have to ratify those proposals for the amendments to become part of the Constitution. This is why having the same subject matter matters. And this is the question that I asked Jeremy Redfern, and I think is a question still for the governor's office, because right now there are over, I think, 400 live petitions trying to call for a convention of the states under Article 5, but we haven't called one. Well, why? They don't agree on the subject matter. And so why would it make sense to propose a separate and different petition and basically start the process all over instead of at least moving forward with the Convention of States that has kind of this broader ability to do exactly what Governor DeSantis is suggesting on balanced budget, term limits for the deep state as well, and judicial reform when it's already passed in 19 states. I mean, the math, 19 is better than 1.
Yeah, and it's confusing to me. I'll give you an example right now. They're proposing term limits. There are 3 states that propose term limits in the way that the governor is promoting right now and Jeremy Redfern was promoting. That means 31 states to go. Well, we have 15 states to go, proposing a broader form of term limits, which is a healthier, safer form of term limits. I would argue the form that they're proposing is actually dangerous for the republic. It empowers the bureaucrats and the staffers. So I'm not sure why. And I can tell you, look, we have over 5 million people in support of what we're doing across the country. And people are confused right now about what the governor is doing. They love the governor, and they appreciate everything the governor's done in Florida. I think we can say unequivocally Ron DeSantis is the best governor in my lifetime, and I'm an older guy. I'm 62 years old, so to me, that's really saying something. I think he was a powerful presidential candidate and has a great national future for him. But on this issue, folks are confused. We've got 5 million people out there wondering, well, why is he doing this?
Yeah, and I think, too, people are confused, and I even get listeners to this program. And I previously had Mark Levin, I've had Mike Ferris, I've had you on to talk about the Convention of States project as a whole, and I think there's a lot of confusion just around what Article 5 actually says, what it means, what it can and also cannot do. And so that kind of basic education is something that we also need to focus on in terms of combating some of these false fears, I would term it that way, from people who genuinely have some concerns, and I think their questions are definitely appropriate, but they need to listen to the legal answers and to the response from experts on this issue, from people like you and Mark Levin, who say this is exactly what the founders provided so that we can restrain the federal government. So in just the last 2 minutes I have with you, Mark Meckler, where can people who maybe aren't quite convinced listening to this, because I get listeners, and I'm sure that there are going to be people who email me today that say, well, we're very concerned about this, and, no, we can't crack open the Constitution. Where can people go to find out more information and genuinely take in that civics education on what Article 5 says and does not say?
Yeah, they can go to conventionofstates.com. If they're in support, they can sign the petition, get involved. If they're just interested in learning and they want to see both sides of this debate, they can go to our FAQs. I think this is really important. Be a skeptic. I think that's a great idea. But then be open to real information. And I would say, Jenna, listen to you. I mean, you've been on this issue for a long time. You were early in and early on. You're a constitutional lawyer. Listen to Mark Levin. Listen to Ben Shapiro. Listen to Professor Robbie George at Princeton. I would say one of the greatest conservative legal scholars alive. Mike Ferris, a constitutional lawyer. Listen to people who spent their lives on this subject matter. Professor Rob Nadelson, the greatest living constitutional lawyer on the subject of Article 5. And then make your own decision. But you can do that at conventionofstates.com. Go to the FAQs. All the information you need is there.
Thanks so much, Mark Meckler. And you're right. I endorsed the Convention of States Project back in 2015, so it's been almost 10 years. It's the last chapter of my book, The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution. So I've been an advocate for a really long time, and I think now is the time to call for an Article 5 Convention of the States. We'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis in the Morning.